Welcome back. Previously on Worlds Asunder.
Now you have to start looking at the overall situation in that area and think about alternate history, not as you think about it as a drop of water hitting a still body of water. Your story is not about the drop hitting the water. It's about the ripples that are created from it.
The stories we've read capture our attention and immerse our minds in settings of all kinds to bring us the spectrum of feelings and deliver the tale of tales to our starving psyches.
Whether it's medieval-style fantasy with mages and knights,
or hard sci-fi takes on the future of space colonization,
or thrillers set in your backyard, world building is the foundation that holds up the narrative, the glue that keeps it from unraveling as readers follow the journey you laid out for them, all to make the stories jump from the pages and burn themselves into our memories.
Welcome, weary writers, to Book Career in a Year's network of podcasts. This is Worlds Asunder, an insightful podcast on world and character building.
My co-host is the one and only David Shadoin, better known as Shady. It's not just a descriptor, it's also his moniker.
And she's the H.Y. Gregor, but you can call her Haley or Sour Patch, your friendly post-apocalyptic wasteland elf.
We know. We have nearly a score of published novels and short stories between us, but who the hell are we to teach you about world building and character development? We get it, which is why we decided to call in some favors.
Each week, we pull from a list of the best and brightest authors, editors, and publishers to give tips and guidance on tackling the age-old questions and provide you with tools on how to accomplish world building like the pros. From environment to magic to characters, how do we strike a balance between what matters to our audiences and what matters to keep it all straight? Open up your ear holes
and your minds
and get ready for us to tear Worlds Asunder.
So, if you're ready,
just knock and enter.
Yeah. One of the things that I think we talk about world building a lot as sort of a foundation for worlds, but I think that building into looking at places where you can use world building specifically to cause conflict is a really important piece of putting stories together.
See, now you're going to open up another rabbit hole. So one of the classes I teach, I actually talk a lot about the movie Star Wars. So, A New Hope, 1977, the first one, and you start thinking about conflicts that are being introduced by the antagonist to Luke Skywalker. The first several conflicts that Luke is having to deal with are things that are set up in world building. They go to town and they're stopped by stormtroopers that are looking for the droids. And they get past the droids, they go to the bar, and then because the bar is this rough and tumble place, and Luke is a smart-ass teenager, he nearly gets killed because he's trying to be, man of the world, and these thugs essentially are like, no, and Obi-Wan has to step in and cut the guy's arm off. So all of that is world building. It's not Emperor Palpatine or in Star Wars case, Grand Moff Tarkin coming in and dropping the conflicts in front of Luke for him to respond to, like you'd see in something like Harry Potter. It's all done through world building because the world has been set up that Luke has been innocent. He doesn't understand what's happening because he's been essentially on the moisture farm on Tatooine, and the universe has moved on in this different direction. So all these different things that are happening at the very beginning, it's all from the construct of the world and the universe itself that are providing the conflicts for Luke and making him change.
Speaking of the classes you teach, one of the classes, yeah,
Thank you.
if you get a chance to take an Ikenberry class, definitely take it. One of the classes that I took, my first superstars from you was a class on writing villains. We're talking about world building, and you can't forget character building inside of that. When you do alternate history, what's really your technique? I have a more leading question that I can follow up with, but what is your technique on writing kind of the hero's POV, the villain's POV, or do you make it a little bit more ambiguous?
It's what I've always taught as far as in the antagonist class. The amount of time that you spend developing your protagonist, you have to do the same with your antagonist. So in The Crossing, all the reading I did on George Washington, I did on Cornwallis. And I did on the General's Grant and such, so that I understood where they were at this particular point. Now, granted, I didn't go all the way through their biographies and their memoirs and all that stuff. I picked the late part of 1776, early part of 1777, so that I could really narrow it down. And it was the same thing. It was that developmental piece where, we understand George Washington because we're taught about George Washington as kids in 4th and 5th grade. But then, what are the British doing? What were their thought processes? How were they looking at this war? Most of them believed that it was going to take one quick strike, the rebellion would be over, and they'd go back to England as heroes, which did not play out that way. So being able to kind of look at the way that they thought, the way that they reacted to what Washington and his forces were doing. Most of the time, the British, there were a lot of the different things I read were like, "What's this guy doing? This is stupid. We just got to find him and we can go wipe him out." They couldn't find him, and then they couldn't wipe him out. And so Washington was using a lot of hubris from the British Army against themselves. And so he was a very good tactical commander in that sense, and he did a lot of things that were unexpected. So being able to balance out with what I was learning about Washington and what was going on with his commanders and his side of the army versus the British, being able to do that and pay attention to both sides made that depth better, and it made the conflict more resonant, which is huge.
Yeah. The kind of the follow-up, so then my leading question there is so if we step away from the, we're Americans talking about the revolution.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So very obviously to us, America's good guy, the British Empire's bad guy. It makes it real easy to paint, Cornwallis as your antagonist in the story. But if we step out of that shell and we get into, if we go to other parts of history, or we're writing alt history in other places where, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but the victors get to write history. Is there any reason to flip that and write it from the protagonist side as, say, like, if we wanted to, we could write it from Cornwallis's point of view? Would you then change how you did the research, or would all of that stay the same?
It'll stay the same. One of my favorite quotes is from Christopher Vogler and the heroes. He actually took the hero's journey and broke it down in what's called the writer's journey. And he actually makes the comment that every antagonist is a hero of their own story. And so if you flip it around and you look at the antagonist as the hero of their own story, I kind of did this a little bit with The Crossing. When you first meet Cornwallis wants to go home. He is one of those folks that believes that it's just going to take the big strike to take out Washington. He has a wife. His wife's name was Jemima, and she was very ill. And she was just had a lot of health problems, and he wanted to get home and be able to take care of her. So that was his motivation, was end this stupid stuff, not necessarily for the king and country and whatever else. I want to go home because my wife needs me. And if you look at the American side, a lot of the people that were fighting were the same way. We need to do this for our country, but it's coming up to spring. I've got to be home to plant. I've got to be home to harvest. I've got to be able to take care of my family. So being able to in a sense, kind of humanize the antagonist is a huge thing, because not all antagonists are going to be pure villains that are 100% evil all the time. They all have reasons. They all have the ways that they do. And the antagonist class kind of breaks down how to look at antagonists and figure out how to make them just a little more human so we can relate to them, because they're just on the other side of a conflict. It's not that they're inhuman. They're on a different side looking at things a little bit differently.
And doing what they're told.
And a lot of times, yeah.
So we've touched on a little bit of the character building. We've touched a little bit on the kind of the ripple effects. Is there any other major pieces that you have to touch in the world building aspect before you put pen to paper, or is it something that kind of develops as you go?
I think when you start writing, particularly alternate history, if you have an idea for the inciting incident and you have an idea where your ripples are, you have to start writing, and you have to kind of go, because then you're going to figure out where are the different things that are going to take place. What are the different things that are going to have impacts, right? And it even got to the point when I was writing The Crossing of what would Washington think about their boots, right? Because you have these combat boots that are roughed out brown leather, because we're talking about wearing the old Army combat uniform, so the brown leather out, but they're laced. Laces were not something that was very popular in footwear at that particular point in time. So how would that look? And then of course they've got the big hole, the big soles and the traction, different, impressions that are made by the different soles. What would they think about that? Because that's going to be something that would be, here's something that we can maybe we can change this. Looking at developing a Kevlar helmet, not so much, but who's to say that they couldn't go to a cobbler with a boot and go, we need to figure out a way to make this. Okay, let's try. And maybe they'd screw it up, but at the same time, maybe within a couple of years, they might have some type of relevant prototype for that time frame of the modern combat boot. Now we're talking about changing the quality of footwear, which, most of Washington's army at the time of 1776, 1777, most of them were barefoot. Or wearing tattered shoes. Now we're talking about wearing a combat boot that you could get thousands of miles off of. That's form-fitting. It's not going to blister. It's going to protect your feet. What would that look like? So the deeper you get into where things could go. I mean, what would George Washington think about an MRE, a ration packet, right? I can tear open this foil pouch with a plastic spoon. They don't know what plastic is. And I can open this thing up and I've got this, spaghetti with marinara sauce that was made probably 10 years ago that's still shelf stable, still fresh. I can still eat it and it tastes pretty decent. What would that be like?
It's way more seasoning than they ever had.
Oh, you're an Air Force guy, so I mean, those types of things. What would that be like? So there's a great scene that I wrote in the End of the Crossing where Thomas Jefferson comes in and he's like, "Show me everything. I want to see everything." Because you could start to imagine then somebody like with Jefferson's particular his mental acuity, being able to figure out, how can I make those boots? Those socks are made out of wool. Why do you have wool socks? How is your clothing stitched? All those things, little things, would have big impacts over the course of the future.
Yeah.
We invent the sewing machine 200 years sooner.
Exactly.
So how do you personally check yourself from going too far down the rabbit hole, right? Because obviously, with all those rebel flags, you named 7 things already, right?
Or did you not?
That it was like, yeah. How did you
not check yourself?
Yeah, that's fair too. How do you keep yourself kind of on task to the plot when you start getting interested? And you're like, oh, this would be an interesting kind of tangent to chase.
So let's go back to interchangeable parts, for example. So if that'll be something that I would see Jefferson starting to play with. It's not going to be something that they're going to do on the first try, or the second try, or the 12th try. It's going to take them a long period of time because they don't have the materials to actually be able to do this yet. But it's going to be able to start that thought process of, okay, if I'm going to make this particular, like a firing pin, for example, if I'm going to take a firing pin, I need to make it look like this. Can I make a mold? Okay, great, I can make a mold, but then I've got to look at the metallurgy of the time frame. Is the metal I'm going to use, is that going to work? They're going to fail. So the idea is not so much that you introduce a technology that's going to be like, we're going to do this right now and it's going to affect the end of the war. Now you're talking about, I'm looking at how things could get to the point where in this particular time frame, they come back in 1776. By the time they get to 2024, they actually have flying cars. Now we're talking about things, how they can impact the future just by those other little pieces. And it's not going to be something that's going to be immediate. I think the things that are immediate are their knowledge, their ideas of tactics, things like wearing a white sheet when it snows for camouflage, that type of thing. It's not going to be interchangeable parts, but it's going to start those great minds of the time frame thinking, how can I do this, right? Imagine, Eli Whitney with the cotton gin, you're moving that up at least 50, 60 years. So how does that work? So there's an opportunity there to just kind of go forward. And as far as going down the rabbit hole, you have to kind of look at, okay, what were they really capable of making at this time? And a lot of cases, it's not anywhere close to what we would need from the metallurgy or the materials aspects. But going back to the thoughts, the techniques, the tactics, the whatever else, those are the things that are going to change things very quickly. Knowledge is a huge power.
So for you, when you were doing all of this, was there anything that you felt like, oh, I did not need to know these things, or that didn't make it into the book, that you felt you kind of were super interested in, but maybe wasn't necessary to the project?
Not really with the crossing. Yeah, not really this time. And I would imagine
Words from the pro.
there'd be other things that might pop up as I go through looking at particular sequels and whatnot. The thing that got me were the more things that I didn't really know, or even things that were like conspiracy theories of the time, or things that we've applied a conspiracy to for right now. So, like for example, going back to Washington's three-pronged attack, the southernmost attack was supposed to be Cadwalader. I think, yeah, Cadwalader going across at one of the other towns, and he was going to be facing Colonel von Donop, who was the actual Hessian commander, not Rahl in Trenton. But von Donop had stayed where he was because he had a lady friend. Well, there's one of the theories that's out there that is that the lady friend was actually Betsy Ross. And I don't know if that's true or not, but looking at, as you start going through different sources and whatnot, then this kind of pops up that it's got to be Betsy Ross because she was in this town and she was whatever else. So there were a lot of those moments, right? There were a lot of things of, like, for example, with the Hessians and their defense of Trenton, we're taught that Washington surprised them and it was just done in minutes. The Hessians actually tried to counterattack 3 times. They tried to gather their forces and counterattack. Then they had to fall back and try to do it again. And on the third counterattack, that was when Colonel Rahl was mortally wounded and everything fell apart. So they were fighting the entire way, and we're taught differently about it. So being able to go in and do the research and look deeper into the subject matter, you learn a lot more stuff, it's really cool. And again, it provided context, but it also provided those inject points where what's something else I could stick in here, or how can I bring the cadets into this particular thing?
So that actually, I'm going to circle back to something that you
Sure,
said
go for it.
A while back that I wrote down because I think is fascinating, and it also interplays with historical fiction. You were talking about some of the medical aspects, where washing your hands, where do you put the latrines? Right. That is something that I think we don't think about for world building, right? You look at medical techniques. Are there things that you think that newer authors overlook when they're trying to look at this kind of genre? Like, what are other things that maybe wouldn't feel really obvious, but culturally might be relevant?
I think it kind of goes back to we get really enamored with technology, right? What did the cadets have with them technology-wise? Okay, yeah, they have their phones and they have some other stuff, right? That's great. They have the modern weapons, they have the modern boots and whatnot. Technology only goes so far because, especially going back to the 1700s, there's not that much that can be manufactured. There's certain aspects of it that they could try to replicate, right. Lacing shoes and that sort of thing, and the high-top boots and whatnot. But they don't have the materials capability to do so. That's where the knowledge piece comes in. So something as simple as washing hands. I mean, that had a tremendous amount of ramifications the more I thought about it. Mm-hmm. And then looking at the Ranger Handbook and how to place a field latrine. If they understood not putting it over there, but actually down there, that's going to, again, those two things are going to cut the dysentery by massive amounts, which then makes quality of life in the camp better and makes the operational readiness of the troops that they could actually take to the field better. And that starts to have second and third order effects. So the knowledge piece was huge.
Yeah, so I think that kind of thing is really important and super cool.
It is. I mean, especially if you're taking somebody from a modern time frame to someplace else, whether it's going back in time, alternate history, or going forward in time, or to an alternate world, we're still going to have knowledge. We're going to have what's in that meat space in our head, and that's going to certainly be different than that other place.
Yeah, considering things that we maybe take for granted that wouldn't even occur.
Exactly.
So.
Kind of brings me to a question that I probably should have asked to start with. But what to you defines alternate history versus historical fiction?
So I think historical fiction, and I've read a lot of historical fiction, especially the books of like Jeff and Michael Shara about the Revolution, This Glorious Cause, and of course they wrote Gods and Generals and Killer Angels about Gettysburg. Historical fiction tries to take what happened in history and apply certain aspects to it. For example, like the Killer Angels is all about the Battle of Gettysburg, and all the tactics and the reports of what actually happened in the battle are 100% accurate. But in historical fiction, there's conversations that we don't know if they really went that way. There's certain things we know that happened, but what was it really like when, in particular with Gettysburg, when Robert E. Lee had to chew out Stuart? about, being more in looking at, his celebrity versus actually providing the intelligence he needed to do as a cavalry commander. What was that conversation like? We don't know, but Shara wrote that. He wrote that out. So historical fiction takes the actual events. We know that Lee had the meeting. We know that he chewed Stuart's ass, essentially, but what was said, we don't really know. So that's where I think the historical fiction comes in. Is, okay, I understand the facts of the situation. We have a really good idea, but there's this piece of it that I have to fictionalize because nobody was there with a recorder to say, all right, General Lee, you go. Now, Stuart, what do you say in response, right? We don't have that. So I think that's the difference with historical fiction, because you stay within those boundaries. In alternate history, you stay within your boundaries to a certain point, but again, that's where that inciting incident happens, and then things kind of can go crazy. And that's where, again, you figure out what it's going to be like. And there's a lot of historical fiction in alternate history, because writing Washington until the point he meets the cadets, I wrote him exactly doing the things that he was doing. But once he meets them, everything gets turned on its head. His mind is opened to other things, and now other things are going to start to happen because of the knowledge that they've shared with him, because he realizes, okay, I've got this proof that we win, right? And my face is on the coin. I understand we win. How did we do so? And how can I take what you've told me and actually accelerate that process? So that's kind of where that comes. That's the difference to me, in my opinion.
So which genre, I almost think, and this may just be my perception, I hear historical fiction and I go, oh, I can kind of do whatever I want because it's fiction, right? Obviously, alternate history is also fiction. Which genre do you think has more leniency as far as
alternate history.
Yeah.
Alternate history.
Yeah, will you dig into that a little bit? Because have you written historical fiction at all?
I
No,
haven't.
okay, but you've read a bunch of it.
I've read a bunch, yeah. So, I mean, again, looking at particularly like the Killer Angels, what's happening in July of 1863 at Gettysburg. We have multitude of reports, both official and not, the different reporters, the different bystanders, people that were watching. We know what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg. And again, those fictional aspects are what's happening, how is a character or someone that was a historical figure, how did they feel? We don't necessarily know how they feel, especially if they were someone who died on the field, right? We don't know what their feelings were. Were they anxious? Were they this? Were they that? So historical fiction gives you, again, you've got the narrowness of the facts that you have to stay within, but you can kind of try to extrapolate, okay, this character was really terrified about Pickett's charge, for example, or the Union soldiers were looking at what was happening going, what are you doing? We've got the high ground, we've got better fire, So there's things that you can kind of play in there that are telling the context of the overall situation. When you get into alternate history, again, you introduce something and something happens, you have almost the wealth of possibilities that you can start to play with. So it's more forgiving in that respect, but the two are very similar.
So where's the line between the two?
I think that the line comes in when you actually change history. Okay. When in alternate history,
like large events, how much?
Again, going back to the Rivers of War with Eric Flint, moving the wound 2 millimeters. It's not a very significant thing as far as we would look back at it, but in that time frame with that particular character, Sam Houston was kind of a badass, and if he had been able to continue being a badass versus being essentially wounded to the point that he was, I won't say barely functional, but he was significantly reduced in his capacity to move and whatnot, totally different story.
Yeah, and it's an interesting genre line to have to draw, and I wouldn't put it too much line on that, but I think I agree with you where it's like, because there is a little bit, if you're saying historical fiction, you're really trying to make things up in the confines of how things played out, right? You're not trying to change history or really the future of history. So, if that M16 doesn't stay lost and you bring it back, but you don't change anything else in the crossing, it could be just as easily historical fiction and we get more sound texture.
Right.
It could be just as easily historical fiction as it could be alternate history, and I don't be afraid to kind of jump on both of those lines. If you think you're sitting in historical fiction, absolutely stay that way. No, one of the things I was thinking of as you kind of discuss the differences is there a way to do alternate history under sci-fi? or are we really just calling it sci-fi, mill sci-fi?
Oh no! So the Destroyermen by Taylor Anderson is a great series that deals with a World War II. I don't remember which class of ship off the top of my head, but it's taken to someplace else, and it's not necessarily going back in time on Earth, but there's like different alien life forms and all this other stuff. So yeah, you can totally do that.
Well, and fantasy as well.
Oh yeah.
You know, if you go back and you say this is the Revolutionary War, but there's magic.
Right.
You know, which is a whole other thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there was something that I didn't really have a good question for it, but it was one of the things that I wanted to point out is that you kept talking about the different technologies, and any technology significantly advanced enough that the characters don't understand it. Now, granted, you're playing both sides of that coin. You have characters that do understand. You have characters that to them it's freaking magic.
Right.
And so that
See Clark.
Yeah, Clark's Law.
Oh yeah, we did.
Clark's third law.
Yep. And we talked a little bit about that. And I don't know when this episode is going to play in comparison, but when you go to see Rowan's interview,
Yeah, with other Clark.
the other Clark that we talk about, we discuss this Clark's Law a little bit. How do you play that enough, or do you even differentiate between kind of the fantasy aspects of introducing technology to history, or do you keep it kind of?
I think with what I was trying to do in The Crossing, it was more looking at it from the analytical mind. You know, again, Washington would have looked at it with fascination. Jefferson would have been fascinated and curious and like, can I replicate this?
Well, and it was a time period when they were discovering a lot of things. You have great minds that were great inventors.
Absolutely.
You know, during that. So.
Absolutely. So I think it would just, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, it would kind of try to accelerate some things, make some changes to what they were seeing. Absolutely.
One of the things that I enjoy, or that I've noticed a lot, is that I think people read historical fiction because they find it to be educational a lot of the time. Are there things that you've seen that maybe are inaccuracies that are the most damning to this kind of story? Or are there things that you feel either would pull people out of the story or misconstrue something that's happening in the timeline?
I think if you're dealing with a topic or a subject area where we don't necessarily have a full grasp on what happened, then you're at risk of, you could potentially change something that people would argue about, right? I don't have any specific examples of something that I've read. Going back again to most of the stuff that I've read historical fiction wise, it stays pretty tightly within those lanes. And understanding, you know, where they could go, what their left and right limits are essentially is, you know, what can I do here? What is going to stay within the facts that we know and provide context in a different way, but not necessarily change how the outcome, if you will, was made. So
do you feel that alternate history gets more readers that are more critical because they say this isn't what would have happened?
You can. I mean, there are. I mean, I had a review. It was like there were no rifles in 1776, which there were, but you know you're going. That's the thing about critics. You're going to get critics no matter what you do, and the more that you can stay within, closely aligned with the facts and don't kind of jump the shark like we were talking about earlier. Don't jump too far ahead, and we're gonna you have the Continental Army manufacturing M16 rifles in 1777. There's no way you can't do that. So if you can take the knowledge piece but not jump too far ahead, you can kind of constrain things with what the capabilities were at the time and such, then you're going to be okay. But there's always going to be a critic. I mean, you can't avoid it.
Right.
We know you well enough to know that Kevin Ikenberry without whiteboards is not Kevin Ikenberry. It's an alien. Am I right, Kelly? Yeah, Kelly Ikenberry is off to the side here, and she's helping us keep Kevin in check.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Surprising lack of heckling.
Yes.
Just keeping it quiet for now.
Yeah, right. Which just means he hasn't lied about anything. He's
Ask her about her whiteboard.
Yeah, there you go.
Got like 4 things.
Perfect. But you have a very particular organizational skill. And you have taught several classes, right? And you're an instructor in more ways than just writing. Yeah. And so you are very organized in a particular way. How did you stay organized for this kind of alternate history? How would you tell our audience a little bit. How did you stay organized when it came to your research?
So the first thing I did was a timeline, right? So I knew I was going to bring the cadets from November of 2008 to essentially December 22nd on 1776. So I started with December 22nd, 1776 and went to January 3rd or so. And that was where I started with, okay, here are the historical events, the main things that I see. And of course, the deeper I got into it, the more things I would have to add in from research wise. But I started with the timeline. That was kind of my base, if you will, on the left-hand side. And then it was like, okay, where are the cadets? Right, so their initial insertion point, then they go to the farm, and then where do they go from there? How are they moving towards Washington? Then where's Washington? What's Washington doing? What is the British Army doing? That column was pretty vacant because they were pretty happy being in garrison. Then talking about the Hessians, what was going on with Colonel Rahl, and then looking deeper into the history, you had this whole group of people called the Hunterdon men that were really trying to basically create an insurgency against the Hessians. They were in enemy territory, harassing the enemy all the time. So Rahl constantly thought Washington was just around the corner, and he was going to come right over the hill right now. And so he got to the point, by the time you get to Christmas Day, he was panicked. He was absolutely, every time there was a rifle shot in the distance, it was a farmer shooting at something or whatever else, he believed it was Washington on the march. So you have all that anxiety and all those different things that you could put in. So then it was, taking this big, in the Army, we'd call it a troop to task matrix, right? So I have my times, I have what's going on in different areas. Then it was pretty simple to kind of figure out, okay, I need to talk, this scene's going to be in this area. What's happening across the spectrum of operations? What are the Americans doing? What are the British doing? What's happening with the Hunterdon men, whatever else? What's the weather doing, right? So I understand everything that's going on. And it sounds really complicated, but it really wasn't. It was just, one or two things. Okay, the high of that day was 37, and it was, a little bit of snow. Low was in the 20s. The Delaware River was unfrozen that day, right? Then what was Washington doing? Well, they were pretty much, in camp doing this. The British were doing this. Rahl, had a parade at, then the resources were great enough to say, okay, Rahl did a parade every day at this particular time. Okay. How do I work that in? Or do I work that in? Or do I just have that as, okay, well, they're just doing their thing again, whatever else. So it was organized, but it was also the idea of framing out what was happening in the entire area that I was dealing with, this 15, 20 square miles. And that way it gave me an opportunity to kind of figure out, if I'm doing something with the cadets here, is it going to affect anything over here? And if it didn't, great. Then I can move on to the next scene. And then if I did this scene and there was, they fire at something or something happens, does anybody hear that? And then going back through the reports, being able to say, hey, the Hessians reported rifle fire to the north at this particular time. Hey, look, I can use that for me. So there were a lot of things that, you could kind of play with. And that took probably a few days to construct after going through the different resources. And then at that point, it was really easy because I would write a scene and go, okay, it's the night of, this particular night, the cadets are here. They're moving to McConkey's Ferry to go meet General Washington. What's happening in Washington's camp? What's their latest intelligence? What are the Hessians doing? Can I get the cadets to Trenton at that point? Can I insert them south of Trenton to hold the Assunpink Bridge? And yeah, it was fun to be able to do.
So I'll interject really quick. From a beginner's point of view, or was this in an Excel document? Did you do it all on the whiteboard? Is there any software or tools that you would recommend? What did that look like?
Paper.
So it was
Notebook paper.
So let there please not ever be a fire in your house.
Just notebook paper. No, well, I mean, you can use whatever technology you want to use. I mean, I did some on my whiteboards. Yes, I have.
Did you have columns laid out?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, this is the weather, and this is the time of day, and this is the character. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it wasn't in depth. I didn't write paragraphs. It was, okay, here's the high and low of the day, right? Or was it cloudy, whatnot, that sort of thing. That was, one column. And then again, where were the British? Well, the British are in garrison. They don't care. Okay, I could kind of do that all the way down. What was Rahl doing? Well, I knew he would do his parade at this particular time every day. Okay, so I could work that in. What were they doing otherwise? Did they send out other patrols, that sort of thing? And then what was Washington doing? Most of the time with Washington stuff, the soldiers were in camp. They were in garrison doing whatever. They weren't necessarily doing training or drills because that didn't come along till the next year. But what was the intelligence he was getting? What were the things that they were working on as far as the staff? What were the things that were happening with Congress or whatever else? And so just one or two sentences about most of them. And I did pretty much all of it on, a notebook that was no larger than what Haley has.
Well, and I think that's a huge thing that could maybe be considered, especially for new authors. We get into, you have to have a Campfire, which is like a world building software, or you have to have Plotter or Novel Crafter. And we get a lot of information about, the things that we should be doing, and it gets really complicated really fast. And I think that beginners especially dig into some of the hype, maybe, of like, this has to be complicated, and it doesn't.
No, it's the KISS method. Keep it simple. The second S is stupid, so keep it simple.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I was like, if you're gonna start it, you may as well finish it.
I know how many letters this is.
Keep it simple. I mean, the idea. Why would I build a Ferrari if a Model T would work, right? So it comes back to, and it's something that you have heard me teach in classes. It's you figuring out what works for you. Now, and I've played with those different softwares, and they're great. I have no problem with them. But for me, it was easier to stand at my whiteboard and go, one or two sentences, or a word, or 2 words. Character does this.
Do you have like strings that go across the?
No,
you don't turn into a meme.
I'm not.
There's no sticky notes.
I'm not that guy. No, just you have to figure out what works for you,
right.
And that's going to be different for every author. And so all those different software programs that are out there, they appeal to different people, and you may love it, you may not. It's perfectly fine. You just have to figure out what works for you.
Yeah, and we all have our things that I swear by. I don't think I could write at all without Scrivener.
I like Scrivener.
Yeah, which is neither here nor there, but.
And we're not being sponsored by Scrivener, so take that for what it's worth. Yeah. Scrivener, if you're looking for somebody to sponsor, we'd love to have you. But no, it's all right. So now I do have to ask. There is one more question for sure, and we've gotten a lot of good information from you today, and hopefully our audience appreciates the amount of wisdom you've passed on to us. But if you had a chance to kill Hitler in a book, would you do it?
Just pitch him a softball, why don't you?
That's not a softball.
I know. We figure every alt history author has asked this question.
Yeah,
eventually.
So if you look at, all right, so historical fiction wise, right? So there's a lot of Band of Brothers that you could say is fictionalized, like conversations and whatnot, because we don't necessarily know what the conversations they actually were. A lot of the guys they talked about certain things that they said, and that certainly worked its way into the script and whatnot. So there were certain things that were could be a fictionalization there. Or you look at the other end of that spectrum to like something like Inglourious Bastards, right, where they did kill Hitler. I think you could certainly do it, and I wouldn't be adverse to doing it, but it would be something again where it would be I'd have to research the hell out of it and make sure that what I was going to tell, I understood how they got to that point, and then what the ramifications would be afterward.
Yeah, I think my favorite trope out of that would be you attempt to kill Hitler and fail. But that's it. I mean, there's already a movie based on that, so somebody's beat me to that idea. Although it's based on a relatively true story.
Yep.
Valkyries, right? Yeah. Valkyrie. Sorry.
Yeah,
Valkyrie.
It's
Tom Cruise.
I remember.
Yep.
It was a decent movie. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Well, Kevin, we appreciate your time. I'm starting to get hungry, and I'm out of margarita.
Oh, no. Why is the rum gone?
Why is the margarita always gone? So we need our bartender back, and we'll probably have to cut this podcast out. But is there any final parting shots you want to leave our audience with?
So we actually talked about the cover earlier.
Oh,
so,
that's
yes,
right. I meant to come back to that.
So-
The cover story.
So
we do have to come back to that.
you're told as an author, especially if you're working in a traditional pub, right? You're working with a Big Five, which Bain Books is essentially an imprint of Simon and Schuster. That you're not going to have any type of input on your book and your cover. And so I remember getting the email from Tony Weiskopf, hey, we're going to do your cover. Do you have any ideas? Well, yeah, I had ideas. So I knew I wanted to take Benjamin Lutz's famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, and I wanted to change it where the people in the boat weren't the partisans or the Continental Army. They were they were the cadets in their modern uniforms with their modern helmets, essentially rowing Washington across the Delaware. And so I wrote that up in the form that I got. They sent it to the artist. The artist's name is Karen Yanner. And Karen writes back like, basically, oh, hell yeah, we're doing this. And so, the idea, it came to fruition, and it's a very visually striking cover. I couldn't be more happy with that. So, you're told, excuse me, from an advice thing, you're told as authors a lot of times that you cannot do this. You can just have an idea, have things available when people come asking for it, and you never know what it's going to actually turn into.
Well, the answer is always no unless you ask, right?
Yeah.
That's
You're welcome for that.
yeah. I've heard it before.
Something that I definitely preach is, the answer is always no unless you ask. And the big thing there is, if you've got an idea, push it. You don't have to just accept certain things, right? Now, eventually, if there's no give and you need to find a compromise, you got to do that. But to some extent, if they're asking you, give your ideas. Don't just like, oh, well, it's whatever you want. If you want something, go after it. And that is such a beautiful cover piece too. And it defined, like, to me, I cannot think of the book without thinking of the cover.
And I can't see the painting without thinking about your book, so it's circular.
I've had the experience of actually seeing it in the bookstore and watching somebody walk past it and stop and come back to it. And actually reach down and pick it up, because it is visually striking. It's designed, and it was designed to kind of give you that opportunity. But like you said, you have to kind of push, but you also have to have a plan. Don't just go in and go, here's my manuscript. You have to have an idea of what you would think the cover would look like. Have an idea of how you think you would write that back cover copy, because you're going to have to write that more times than not. So you have to have ideas, and you have to be able to articulate them and be able to take action on them.
And that was one of the things, even a little bit with, and you're used to working with Chris Kennedy Publishing, much like we have. But like my most recent book, Companion to Ghosts, we had an idea of exactly, we wrote the entire story based off of an idea of what the cover would look like. Yeah. So it was, it was one of those things where we kind of pushed that out, and we hit Chris with our pitch, and even though it was a quick turnaround, he made it look good. So. Yeah.
I was very close to what you requested in Envision, and it worked really well.
I went to a writing conference one time where I made a comment about having design inputs on one of my first covers, like Super Protocol. And I remember another attendee at this conference was just completely scolded me. You can't tell people that, because most of these people are not going to get the opportunity to develop any of their covers. You can't say that and I basically said, that's what I did. I said, here's what I wanted on the cover. And I'm 25 for 25. So, I've been able to have a plan and be able to articulate that and say, here's what I'm thinking for the cover, or here's a starting point, right? I don't necessarily have to say, here's exactly what I want, but here's the starting point. And I've had the opportunity, again, 25 books they're all, I've had that cover input on.
And I have a feeling, for those who've worked with cover artists before, you're going to find artists like having an idea, because if they're told to start from a blank canvas too, right? Now they've got to go do a bunch of extra research to try and figure out what's going to match the aesthetic. And it's much easier if they start from a point where you're at, versus where like it's blank and then you're trying to give them notes back and forth, and it gets a lot harder that way.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, now that we have done the cover story, and thank you for reminding me, because I really liked how that played out. Is there any other parting shots you have?
Whatever you choose, if it's alternate history, historical fiction, whatever genre, have a plan. And it's not just write the book, but it's everything else beyond that.
And a lot of the stuff we discussed, you'll hear a lot of repeat themes in world building in general. And then it really just comes into the finer details of what is it that's going to be slightly different about urban fantasy versus historical fiction versus alt history. And that's why we try and help you kind of define a little bit of the line, so that way you know where you want to focus your efforts. But at the same time, right, don't be afraid to push the bounds. Sometimes there is something that we haven't discussed, right? And the only way we get better as authors in general is by pushing the bounds a little bit, pushing the limits. Because if we don't, you're essentially staying within whatever people have already done in the past. And if you're just repeating the past, you're not entirely creating something new. Yeah, more sound texture. Lovely. Love magpies. They're my favorite.
I hate these guys.
Yeah,
They
go
want their
ahead.
input. They have
Wow.
opinions.
Haley, do you have anything else?
No, I think we've pretty much covered. I mean, I'm sure we could talk for another 3 hours if we wanted to, but as far as our, foundational stuff, I think is awesome.
Kevin, thank you again for joining
No
us.
worries.
Thanks for hosting us at your house. It's
Yeah,
a
no
wonderful
worries.
little backdrop. Kelly, thank you as well. Can't forget.
It's time for margaritas.
It's definitely time for margaritas.
I've been waiting.
She's waiting for food. We're all waiting for food and more margaritas. Yeah, we're out of drinks. And Kevin, what's next for you? Where can people see you / see your work next?
So, of course, my website, kevinikenberry.com. I'm on all the different social medias. I have a trilogy that will be coming out through Athon Books in the fall, which is The Buzzer War, which is a brand new universe that I've created. All 3 books are written and turned in. Very excited about that. It's a lot of fun to be able to write tank and tank warfare in the future, along with futuristic fighter squadrons and that sort of thing. So it's a lot of fun. So I'm looking forward to that.
Very cool. Haley, what else would you like to plug?
I guess always check out, chriskennedy.com. The other thing that we didn't talk about was you also have a nonfiction about plotting.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a little bit more there. If you have the opportunity or if you're curious.
That's called The Mercenary Guide to Story Structure, and you can find that on Amazon under me.
The great thing about that one is it's fairly short and it breaks down several different structures. And so if you don't want to have to read something that's like 500 pages long and tells you exactly what to do, it's a perfect place to start.
Think Cliff Notes for story structure.
It's great.
And we'll drop all of the links and stuff in the show notes for this episode, and you can like Haley said, go check out chriskennedypublishing.com if you get a chance. Athon, since you've got some stuff coming out from them.
Yep.
Very exciting.
Yeah, super exciting stuff. And there you'll see some more projects with the Kevin Ikenberry name on it. Some stuff that he can't quite talk about yet, but I'll go ahead and throw that little
He's very cool.
that little little lead off there that we can't give information out and bury the lead.
Fingers crossed.
And as always, you can catch us at Book Career in a Year Network. This is the Worlds Asunder podcast, and we'd like to thank Kevin Ikenberry once more for being a guest on the show. We will definitely have him back to discuss other things. He is a master of story structure and a great author and a really good dude, and we like to hang out with him, so you'll see him more. On that note, you might be able to catch us on another podcast, which is tentatively titled the Who the Are We podcast.
Who the are we? Let's try that again.
No, I'm leaving it right there, because what Kevin doesn't know is I'm about to make that a running joke, and I'm gonna just start putting bleeps and random words in our podcast title. But he'll find that out as he watches the episodes we record.
Perfect.
So you'll be able to catch us on a different podcast, and then of course you can always find me at davidshdoyan.com. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week. This is probably actually the end of episode 2 of Kevin Ikenberry, so we'll catch you some other time on Worlds Asunder. Thanks for stopping by. All right, we're done.
For the who to what?
Nope.
All right.
I'm gonna bleep the whole thing.
Okay, I have turned off.
Yeah, you're good.
And that's all she wrote for margaritas and research, because we ran out of margaritas, so the interview had to stop somewhere. Thanks again to Kevin Ikenberry, and hopefully you learned something, whether it's researching for historical fiction or your next alternate history or urban fantasy, sci-fi. It all requires some sort of research tactics, and we hope you took something away from this. Thanks for stopping by and listening to Worlds Asunder, and we'd like to thank Nick Thacker and Book Career Network for hosting us. As always, you can find our links and follow the authors by going to our show notes and seeing where you can find them next. Next week, we'll host Gail Carriger on archaeology and treacle tarts, part 1. It's a fun, cozy interview. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, thanks for helping us tear the worlds asunder. We'll see you next time.